Sometimes we have to talk about uncomfortable things. Among those things is the idea of collecting late fees. Many landlords really don't like collecting late fees, but I have to tell you, it's one of the more important things you can do to make sure you have a sustainable rent collecting business. We're talking all about late fees today. Let's get started. You know, landlords sometimes suffer from this issue of guilt when it comes to collecting additional money. Even the rent itself is sometimes an issue for landlords. They have a difficult time coming to the tenants and saying, hey, you owe me some money. Unless you're able to have this conversation and have it often, you're going to find yourself being taken advantage of by people who would really prefer not to pay you that money. And the truth is, most of us really don't enjoy paying money, but some of us are just better at it than others. Some of us are really good about paying bills on time, getting things out there on or before that due date, but others of us not so good. And so when it comes to collecting rent from a tenant, particularly a tenant who has difficulty paying on time, some landlords even stress out about talking about late fees. In fact, many landlords will tell me, Ernie, I'm just happy to get the base rent. If I get that, I am totally fine. It doesn't matter to me if it's 10 days late, 20 days late, a month and a half late. As long as I get it, I'm going to be fine. And I'm going to tell you straight out, that's a terrible business idea. If you're not respecting your own terms, if you're not enforcing your own terms, it's going to be very difficult for the tenant to do that. Again, when you're not willing to do that yourself. So today we're going to talk about all the things you need to do in order to properly collect late fees and why it's a great idea. First off, you have to mention the fact that you will be collecting late fees. It's not enough that your lease even says when that's going to happen and to what degree that will happen in the event that a tenant pays late. I always tell landlords, just assume that your tenant isn't reading the lease. If you make this assumption and it turns out you're right, you're going to be glad that you verbally mentioned to your tenant before you ever handed over those keys the fact that late rent comes with a late fee. Now, across the country, there's going to be different mechanisms for calculating this, and there's going to be different parameters for figuring this out. Not everybody allows a late fee after the first day that rent is late. Some states, Texas included, require a bit of a waiting period. And so, if you're not talking about it though, your tenant may not think that that is a part of the lease that even really matters, particularly if you don't act like it matters. By talking about it at the beginning, you're letting your tenant know, yes, this definitely matters, and you definitely will be charged a late fee if you pay late. That being said, you do have to enforce that term. The fact that you talked about it is a good first step, but it certainly isn't the only step. If your tenant submits payment late, make sure you are also demanding that they pay rent plus late fees in accordance with the lease. Emphasizing, of course, that you want the rent paid on time. If your lease specifically says it's due on or before the first day of the month, then yeah, you should emphasize to your tenant that that's when rent is due and that's when you expect to collect the rent from them. But if it turns out that they hit that magic number, whatever it is, of days after the rent is due when you can charge them late fees, make sure you are collecting those late fees. Make sure that you know when they're due and that you are calling your tenant on them. Make sure that every time that tenant is late, they're paying both the rent and also all of the late fees that are owed at the time of that payment. Now, in order to talk about late fees, and in order to enforce late fees properly, you got to know what you're doing. You've got to understand the late fee rules that pertain to renting property in your area. You need to know when it's appropriate to charge late fees, what is an appropriate amount to charge, and really what is your absolute limit in the amount that you can charge your tenant, depending on just how late they end up being. If you don't know these parameters, it's really hard for you to enforce them well, and particularly difficult for you to speak about it intelligently. So if you don't know, don't just assume that your tenant's gonna know, and certainly don't assume that they're gonna know for you. Make sure you understand well in advance what your parameters are. For example, do you know when your state allows you to begin assessing late fees against a tenant? In Texas, the property code says that a late fee cannot be assessed until after 2 full days have passed from the rent date. It's not stated really super well, but essentially what the code says is in Texas, you can't assess a late fee until day 4. So day 1 it's due, or before. 2 additional days, 2 full days have to pass, 2 and 3. And so on day 4 in the state of Texas, you can assess a late fee. So then the question is, what is an appropriate amount to charge for a late fee? And unfortunately, I see a lot of landlords kind of relying on older information when it comes to the appropriate amount to assess for a late fee. They'll arbitrarily charge $50 and then $10 a day thereafter, no matter what the rent amount is. And I tell landlords all the time, I'm like, you've got a $2,000 a month rent. $50 is 2.5%. Maybe that's good, but $10 is virtually nothing every day thereafter. I'm not sure that this is a good way to go about charging late fees, because I don't know that it's going to be prohibitive. I don't know that it actually gets the point across to charge so little at this rate. So it also helps to know what your limit is. And I use that as a basis for calculating how much is actually appropriate. In the state of Texas, there are limits for single-family homes as well as multi-family dwellings. For a single-family home, a Texas landlord can charge 12% of the monthly rent. For a multifamily, it is 10. And I advise landlords to collect the entire maximum amount within 7 days. And so for a single family home, this is very easy to calculate. Since in Texas, you have to wait until day 4, I recommend a 3% fee for each day. So let's make the math very, very simple and assume that the rent for a particular dwelling is $1,000. And so at $1,000, 3% comes out to $30. So $30 on the first day, but I recommend $30 each day thereafter up until day 7. You get 30, 30, 30, and 30. Day 4, day 5, day 6, and day 7, you get a total of $120. Guess what? You're at your max by day 7. You might be asking yourself, well, Ernie, what if they pay sometime after day 7? Well, no matter when they pay, they've already maxed out and you can't charge them anymore. But there's no reason to continue the delay. In fact, my recommendation in this situation is on day 7, if you still haven't received rent, issue a notice to vacate along with the maxed out late fee charge. At that point, you're actually telling the tenant it's time to go. That's the longest I will wait to receive payment. Guess what? This is also something you can talk about at the beginning of the lease. When you're describing the fact that you will enforce the late fee, you can let them know by the 7th day, if I haven't received all of the rent and all of the late fees, you will be getting a written notice to vacate. By knowing when your state will allow you to assess a late fee, by knowing what amount is appropriate for your situation, and then by knowing your upper limit, just what is that max, you can reach it sooner and you can enforce your late fees much more effectively. Landlords, I know you're getting valuable information out of today's video. If you would, give us a like, please. Any questions or comments you want to add down here, please, you're welcome to do that. I'll respond to those myself. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please consider subscribing. But to move right along, it's important that along with enforcing your late fees, that you're also issuing written notice to your tenant. You want your tenant to know, look, if this continues, and happens over and over and over again, not only will I continue to charge you additional fees in accordance with state law, in accordance with our lease, but ultimately this can lead to eviction. And so you want to document the late payment with a written notice of default. Make sure you are submitting these every time your tenant violates the lease for whatever the violation is, but particularly when it comes to late payment. You want your tenant to know this is not something that will be tolerated, and ultimately something that can, lead you to terminate the lease and have them removed from the property. The more serious the tenant knows that you are about on-time payment, the likelier it is they will pay you on time. And finally, when it comes to late fees, I'm not against forgiving them, but forgiveness should be rare. If you are constantly waiving late fees, you're shooting yourself in the foot and you're sending a terrible message to your tenants, one that you will ultimately regret because they will take advantage and then some. So if you're going to waive late fees, this is something that I advocate a once in a while, maximum once every 12 months, and certainly not within the first 6 months. And here's why. If you've got a tenant who's paid rent on time every time for 6 months, and then sometime in month 9, they hit a snag, it's never happened before, it'll never happen again, and you're pretty sure of this because of the way they've handled their business and maybe what's come up. Maybe something truly bad has happened and they just need a little break. In these situations, I'm perfectly fine. I think it's a good customer service move that you can utilize as a way to establish a good connection and maintain a good connection with your tenant. But also, by doing this, and not only are you acknowledging that this is a one-time thing, you're doing this because, again, you trust that tenant will thereafter continue to pay everything on time. So this wouldn't be something that I would mention up front. Instead, save this in your back pocket for someone who has a long track record of paying on time, and this one fluke comes up where they cannot pay on time. Maybe for this particular occasion, you say, look, I'm going to give you a one-time pass because in all other occasions, you've paid on time. If you're going to forgive late fees, you make it a very, very rare occasion. Landlords, I hope you were able to benefit from the ideas in today's lesson. And look, I get it. It can be difficult to assess late fees, especially if you've never done it before. But it is something that if you're going to get good and you're going to make your business profitable, that you have to get through. It's a skill that you have to acquire, and it's something that if you're just starting out is a good practice. Make sure not to skip these kinds of things because these kinds of things will add up and ultimately could, with incident after incident after incident that goes unaddressed, ruin the tenancy altogether. However, if you get ahead of it, if you're consistently enforcing it, you're likely going to maintain profitability and possibly take what is otherwise a subpar tenant and turn them into a good tenant because they're following the rules that you continue to enforce. I hope you found this video helpful. I know that there's a ton of content here. In fact, YouTube seems to think that this video right here is the next best thing that you should watch. Please watch it and any of the other content you find on this channel. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.